began at the commencement of this record, he, or more likely the scribe who composed the roll, as we'll discuss momentarily, was referring to the commencement of this scroll. So if the Book of Abraham was attached on here, but the Abraham text said at the commencement of the scroll right here, it would seem natural to think that perhaps this was the Book of Abraham text. But more likely, he was referring to the beginning of the scroll when he said beginning of the record, scroll and record being interchangeable there. The question then arises, why would an important Semitic document, the Book of Abraham, be attached to a pagan Egyptian funerary text? First, it's important to understand that despite the claims of the critics, some Egyptians had a detailed knowledge of Abraham. In more than one known instance, Egyptian papyri, which contained Egyptian instructions on one side, also included Semitic writings on the backside. In one case, Psalms chapters 20 through 55. One Egyptian temple archive with an extensive collection of Egyptian rituals provides the only manuscript for the prayer of Jacob that is included in the Charles Worth Pseudepigrapha volume, as well as 2 copies of the 8th book of Moses, which discusses the initiation into the temple at Jerusalem. The most commonly invoked deity in the collection is Jehovah. Moses and Abraham are also mentioned in the collection. Kevin Barney posits that the Book of Abraham material was passed on through generations from Abraham to Jews of the 3rd century BC or the Ptolemaic period, just as Old Testament scriptures were passed on to later generations. Sometime in the Ptolemaic period, a hypothetical Jewish redactor, which is an editor, whom Barney calls J-Red, attached the Book of Abraham to the Egyptian papyri. Why? Because of the useful symbolism contained on the vignettes of the Egyptian funerary text. Numerous studies show that all people recontextualize images according to their current environments and specific needs and beliefs. Early Mormons, for example, recontextualized Masonic symbols for temple use. Early Christians adapted common pagan symbols to convey Christian truths. This phenomenon is found throughout the world. It seems very likely that the Egyptian vignettes, as reproduced in the Joseph Smith Papyri, provided the rich symbolism that could graphically convey ancient Jewish beliefs about Abraham. This claim is supported by several known ancient Jewish texts. As an illustration of Semitic recontextualization of Egyptian material, Barney notes that many biblical scholars believe that an ancient book, the instructions of Menemope, may have been the source for portions of the biblical book of Proverbs. The ancient and recently discovered Testament of Abraham has several similarities to the LDS Book of Abraham. The book also has strong similarities to an ancient papyrus related to the Book of the Dead. For example, notes Barney, it is widely recognized that a judgment scene described in the Testament of Abraham was influenced by an Egyptian psychostasy, which is a soul-weighing papyrus. It may even be that the author of the Testament of Abraham was gazing on such an Egyptian psychostasy when he penned his account. But while there is a clear relationship between the Egyptian psychostasy scene and the judgment scene of the Testament of Abraham, the scene has been transformed to accord with Semitic needs and sensibilities. Osiris, which is an Egyptian god, has become Abel. The Egyptian gods have become angels. Our author looks at the Egyptian illustration, yet sees a situation people with Semitic characters. Now, note the Osiris-Abel connection, because we're going to come back to that in a second. Another example comes from the book of Luke's story of the rich man and Lazarus. In this tale, the beggar Lazarus ate the crumbs that fell from a rich man's table. When Lazarus died, angels carried him to Abraham's bosom. When the rich man died, he woke in hell, but could see far away Lazarus in the bosom of Abraham. The rich man begged Abraham to send the dead Lazarus to his brothers so that they would repent and not befall the same terrible fate. Scholars have shown that this story is based on a popular Jewish tale written in Hebrew, but is ultimately dependent on an Egyptian legend. In the original Egyptian story, the names are different, as are some of the general details of the story, but the basic account and moral is the same. In the Egyptian version, however, the version upon which the Hebrew tradition depends, Osiris plays the part later adapted by Jews to Abraham. It seems that the early Jews had no problem adapting the pagan god Osiris to an important Judaic figure such as Abel or Abraham. Not only do we see in the book of Luke a Jewish adaptation of an Egyptian judgment scene, but we also find some interesting parallels to Facsimile 1 from the book of Abraham. In this vignette, Joseph identified the figure laying on the lion couch as Abraham. Egyptologists, however, identify the figure as Osiris. Based on an early Judaic adaptation of Facsimile 1, Joseph got it exactly right if we view this vignette from within a context of a Ptolemaic period Jewish understanding. Instead of focusing on how Egyptians of the 2nd century BC or 2000 BC understood the motifs, Barney argues that Abraham did not draw the vignettes, which date nearly 2,000 years after Abraham lived, but that these Egyptian vignettes were either adopted, copied wholesale as the Egyptians drew them, or adapted, altered to more accurately reflect the Semitic perspective by an Egyptian Jewish redactor as illustrations of the attempt of Abraham's life and Abraham's teaching astronomy to the Egyptian. Barney argues that we should focus our attention on understanding how Jews of the 2nd century BC understood the Egyptian graphics. In Facsimile 1, the lion couch scene, for instance, under the floor there's a crocodile. Under the crocodile are numerous vertical lines. Joseph interpreted these lines as representing the pillars of heaven. Egyptologists, however, tell us this is incorrect. The lines really signify the palace facade. The etched lines around the crocodile signify, according to Joseph, Recontextualizing, or the expanse or firmament over our heads, or the high heavens. Egyptologists, however, tell us that the lines are simply waters in which the crocodile swims. So according to the Egyptian interpretation, Joseph got it all wrong. What if we compare Joseph's interpretation to how 2nd century BC Jews might have understood this scene? Firstly, Joseph's Recontextualizing that's the actual Hebrew word for expanse. In Hebrew cosmology, writes Barney, the Hebrew firmament was believed to be a solid dome supported by pillars. Recall the vertical lines in the vignette. This, in turn, was closely associated with the celestial ocean, which it supported. And remember that in Facsimile 1, it appears that the pillars are under the water in which the crocodile swims. In the lower half of the facsimile, we have the firmament connected with the waters as the celestial ocean, appearing to be supported by pillars and being solid and therefore capable of serving as a support, in this case, the lion couch scene. The bottom half of Facsimile 1, there we go. The bottom half of Facsimile 1 would have looked to J-Red much like the microcosm of the universe, which is in much the same way that the divine throne chariot of Ezekiel 1 through 2 was associate the four-faced fiery living creatures, it's hard to say, with the firmament, and above their heads on which God sits enthroned is a microcosm of the universe. If we accept the Jewish redactor adapting Egyptian motifs to a Hebrew understanding, we can easily appreciate the possibility that J-Red attached the Book of Abraham manuscript to the Book of Breathings, the Census text, in order to graphically convey the doctrines portrayed in the Book of Abraham document. Barney gives this useful comparison to the Book of Mormon. Quote, "The gold plates were untouched by human hands from the time Moroni deposited them in a stone box until the 5th century AD, until Joseph's retrieval of the cache in 1827. Prior to that time, however, the records of the Book of Mormon peoples underwent an express redaction process at the hands of Mormon and Moroni. Similarly, the papyrus source for the Book of Abraham sat untouched from the time it was deposited in the tomb during the Greco-Roman age until Lobolo retrieved it in about 1820. Before that time, though, it circulated among people and was subject to normal transmission processes. My hypothetical redactor, J-Red, was in essentially the same position with respect to the Book of Mormon as Mormon was with respect to the Book of Abraham as Mormon was with respect to the Book of Mormon." So coming back to the currently Egyptian papers, the relationship between the Census text, oh, I missed a slide, there we go, and the commencement of this record, we realize that this record probably referred to the beginning of the combined scrolls that begins with Facsimile 1, but not the beginning of the Abrahamic text. It must be remembered that Joseph could not read Egyptian. He could not translate in the normal sense. He translated by the power of God. It's possible that Joseph at times translated the Book of Mormon while the plates were covered, or perhaps even while the plates were removed from the room. While I believe that an actual Book of Abraham manuscript was present and probably appended to the Census text, it's significant to recognize that the revelation was a method by which the text was translated. This realization allows for other possibilities. If, for example, the appended Abrahamic scroll was damaged, Joseph would still have been able to translate the text. If the appended scroll was partially missing, the translation might not have suffered. It's also possible that Joseph, in the process of creating the Kirtland Egyptian papers, looked at the Egyptian characters and, thinking that they were the Egyptian symbols composed by Abraham, proceeded to translate from these characters. In such a scenario, the actual Book of Abraham translation could still be based on a real manuscript, but not on what Joseph thought was the manuscript. Whichever scenario, we need not reject Joseph's prophetic calling. And we have evidences supporting an authentically ancient Book of Abraham. In Facsimile 2 are 4 mummy-like figures known to Egyptologists as the sons of Horus. Their images were also in the canopic jars